And we're on. Alrighty. So, hey viewers, this is Cindy Cohn of the EFF, kind of one of my heroes of the digital privacy world. Done some amazing work with like the Ross Ulbricht case. She helped to Diebold voting machines, and after all sorts of security flaws were exposed. Done a lot of great work in the digital law space, and it's a huge privilege to have her here today. So without further ado, go ahead and complete the introduction, because I'm sure I've left some stuff off.
Well, thanks. I am lucky enough to get to be the executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I've been the executive director for about 6 years now, but before that, I was the legal director. So, as you know, Carter, I've been doing kind of as an outside lawyer. So I'm a lawyer by training. I don't know, I'm happy to talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've kind of been getting into the artificial intelligence development game recently, been working on my own framework for sonic analysis. I'm not building the next facial recognition engine or anything like that, that's for sure. But I know a lot of the common questions I get from people who don't really know a lot about the world of programming and technology tend to center around their fears of AI. And I feel like there's a few bad actors in particular who have given the field that reputation at large. And so I really kind of wanted to get into issues of responsibility in the use of this technology. And so I guess a great place to start would be to get some of your thoughts on some of the current cases surrounding companies like Clearview, HiQ, Utah's favorite, Ban.jo.
Well, I mean, I think that the way I think about, well, first of all, I mean, I think you can't start any conversation by pointing out that many of the things that people call artificial intelligence are not actually artificial intelligence in the kind of Marvin Minsky, MIT, the definition of the term. Most of them are either statistical analysis or maybe machine learning on top of statistical analysis. And so I've surrendered. I used to fight this all the time and be like, that's not AI, that's, statistics with a side of machine learning. But I've given up. I will call it AI now because it's, it's not the best. It's not, I haven't given up on hacker yet, but I have given up on AI.
Yeah, the nomenclature gets confusing a lot to people who don't know, like, oh, it has to be self-training to be artificial intelligence.
Correct. But, and it's not the same as an AGI, right? But so one of the things that I think is most important when you're thinking about machine learning or artificial intelligence is who bears the responsibility if you get it wrong, right? All of these systems are trying to classify things as one thing or another. Classifiers are kind of central to all of this. And who are you serving, and who gets hurt if you get it wrong, and are they in charge of what's happening? I think that those threshold questions will take you a long way towards thinking about what's ethical and unethical to do. So let's talk about Clearview AI. Clearview is a company that has gone around and scraped the public, although some of it's not so public, but the public internet for faces, and then tried to tie them to people's offline identity. None of that is done to help you, right? You bear the consequences if they get it wrong, if the cops show up like they did for that poor guy in Detroit and get a match on your face without it. I don't know if you know about this story, but there was a man in Detroit who spent, I don't know, 4 or 5 so bad and didn't even really look like him. But yet the cops relied on it. They used it to pick him up, and they used to keep him in jail for a while. And, he was lucky to keep his job. Not very many people can suddenly disappear from the world for 6 or 7 days and still keep their jobs and their families. And, luckily he did. But so who bears the cost if it's wrong? if it's not the people who are developing the AI, then you should have red flags up all the time, and you really have to think hard about how to protect them. Recognizing that you're going to have false positives and false negatives in any kind of a classification system. What are you going to do with your false positives? What are you going to do with your false negatives? And how are you going to make sure that that lands on the right people? So I am very supportive of people using these systems to tell themselves more about what they're doing. EFF has a case right now called Project Recon. These are some law professors who are trying to gather information about parole decisions being made by the California Department of Parole, to try to see, who's getting parole and who isn't. Can we find some patterns in that behavior that we otherwise wouldn't have? Now, it's done by some law professors, but it's self-reflective. It's trying to help the parole board understand better where it might have biases. That's a really good use of a machine learning system to me. Now, if that same thing was pushed outward and trying to decide who gets parole, well, then the people who bear the consequences if it's wrong are not the parole board, the people who are running it. They're the inmates who are seeking parole. That's, to me, is a very big red flag, potentially misuse of AI. So to me, that's like the threshold question for any of these systems, no matter what you're building it for. Who are you building it for? Who's going to use it? And who bears the consequences when you are wrong? Because you will be wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also introduces kind of the issue like the NSA has. What are you going to do with all of this big data, right? If you've got more files than a million workers could read in their lifetimes, are you actually serving anyone by collecting that much data and potentially risking Fourth Amendment encroachments, among others?
And tons of false positives and false negatives. The bigger those data sets are. And I guess the other thing that, one is who bears the consequence you're wrong. The other one is, do you know the ground truth, right? Do you know what a right answer is and what a wrong answer is? And one of the things that we have a big problem with in these predictive policings, or people are selling these silly things that are supposed to be, it's almost like, what they call it, phrenology, when you try to read the bumps on somebody's head. Like, I can tell from your face whether you're an honest person or not. I mean, that, but one of the things that all of those things are missing, in addition to some common sense, is the ground truth. Who's a liar, who's not a liar. So you can't predict something. You can't train a system unless you know the difference between the truth or false. So anything that's trying to predict what happens in the future based on what's happened in the past is going to be vulnerable to this problem, because by definition, we don't know what the future is yet. And so those kinds of uses are really problematic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, are there any current lawsuits happening around deep neural networks, AI, kind of that umbrella, that you think any like developers getting into the field should really be aware of that? Or does the coast look fairly clear for now?
Well, I think that there are, I don't know of many deep neural network based things, and that's largely because those things are not being used nearly as much as really simple databases and machine learning are. But I think the dangers are really true, are the same ones that we're seeing from one to the other. And one of those is just obviously racism, right? I mean, for anything that involves humans, whether it's your face or your voice or any of those kinds of things, we are finding over and over again that training data is biased, and sometimes it's not because of there doesn't have to be anything evil around that. The training data tends to be biased. If you're scraping the internet and you're looking for faces, you're going to find people who are on the internet, which skews a certain way. The percentage of the world's population that isn't on the internet at all and shouldn't have their pictures up there at all skews really brown and black, right? It's not white people are on the internet a lot more. So even if you're just doing something like, oh, I just took a whole bunch of stuff off the internet and that's my training data, it's going to have biases built in, and you may not even know what they are. Sometimes you do. Again, we're all learning about facial recognition, but sometimes those biases can't be seen at all.
Yeah, exactly. Until we get some more advanced image processing utilities that can really be used by a framework like, say, Berkeley's Cafe, for instance, we're going to have a problem with racist AIs. And that's, I think, and the other thing is, like you said, SEO affects the training models in this context. Yeah. The publicity affects the training models. An excellent example was like when Microsoft put their AI up, And within 3 days, trolls turned it into a Nazi.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can't, I mean, you know, what they call it, convenience data, I think is what the statisticians call it, right? And they do a lot of really careful things to try to adjust the data in other kinds of things. You know, you talk about public health, epidemiology, you know, the machine learning and statistical analysis didn't start on the internet, it predates it. But even those can be incomplete. And I think that it's really hard to think like you've been completely controlling for all the ways in which human beings or the data you find could be biased. I think it's really, it's not something that you do as an afterthought.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, you know, in around here in particular in Utah, where it was revealed, you know, CEO of Ban.jo was a drive-by shooter of a synagogue in the 90s. That kind of, you know, once again stokes the flames of giving this field of research a really bad reputation. And you can't really sit back and do anything but say, yeah, I see your point, you
Well,
know?
I do think that you know what happened was we had the pendulum all the way over here, where anything that said AI was magical, perfect, and was going to make our lives better, right? We had this moment, and now we swung all the way to the other side. You know, anything that smacks of AI is like evil racist thing. And you know, it's a technology, it's a set of processes. For any set of processes, they're not really inherently anything. They simply reflect the society. But if you've got a racist society or you've got racist cops and you're trying to build data off of what they do, you're going to build in and even make worse whatever racism was in the underlying data. That's why we've come out so strongly against predictive policing models, because they really only predict what the police do. They don't predict what crime is. And, you know, if the police want to predict what they do and run this data on themselves so they can figure out how they could better serve the community, it's not a bad thing. But if they're trying to use it to decide whether I'm a thief or you're a thief, or, you know, the fact that your brother lives in your house, you know, means that you're more likely to be a thief, well, then the people who are getting affected are not the people who are running the system.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of on the note, I don't know if you saw like the recent John Oliver episode regarding some of these deep learning image-based systems, but you know, we met because I have a startup I'm working on, and I got to be a part of that panel discussion about keeping my users' data safe from the state. Being a music streaming service, I'm not super worried that anything really gnarly is going to end up on my website. Maybe the occasional hate music, but that'll get flagged quick enough. We'll be able to take that down within a week in most cases. But there are some other startups out there who may have a more pertinent need to look into protecting some of their users' data. So are there any like resources that you could point people like that to so that they could at least get like the basic kit for starting to protect their users from this sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, EFF has a set of things called Who Has Your Back, which is a series, but you can go back over time where we track how people who have other people's data are doing in protecting that data from law enforcement. And we have a set of things that we rate companies on. You have to look back a couple years. We've been doing content moderation last year, but if you go back further, you'll find the law enforcement ones and the things that we are tracking. Do you have a really clear policy? Do you require a warrant before you give out content information? Do you capture only what you need, keep it only as long as you need it, and get rid of it after that? I mean, there is a really strong argument to be made that the best thing that you can say when the cops come and ask you for information about your users is to say, we have a policy, we don't keep it.
Yeah.
For instance, the Internet Archive does a pretty good version of that. Now, sometimes you need the data in order to do the thing that you're doing. But Google has just decided that they're only going to keep people's data for 18 months. That's going to be the default. Now, I think that's still too long and they still have way too much data, but doing a little internal soul searching about what you need, how long you need it for, and then getting rid of it afterwards. I'll tell you, just as a lawyer, when your client gets a request from the government to turn over all this information, the amount of information that they just have laying around ends up being really, it's not just because it's, I care about users, I want to protect users, I want to protect you, but let me tell you, it'll save you money if you don't have a lot of data lying around that you
Yes.
don't need.
Absolutely. Federal lawsuits are one of the most expensive propositions you could ever face as a business.
Yep.
And
So
that's that.
having,
And with
yeah,
distributed computing power these days, some of these fancy backends you've got, like, the Apache stuff, you can actually make it so users just opt to store their own metadata in exchange for a little computing power whenever they log on.
no, that's nice. Excellent.
Yeah, that's really what I'm basing a lot of my backend server technology on is, hey, you keep a file on your computer, all your metadata goes onto your device when you log off. We
Mhm.
wipe it from our system, and then as soon as you log back on, we use the data again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we only know where you're going when you're logged on the site, and you're in LA on vacation, you're in Detroit on vacation, and you want to know, hey, what's happening in the music scene in this city, then we can go ahead and use that. But there's really no purpose for us to keep it otherwise. So, and it's expensive for us to store. That's the other thing. I don't
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want to spend millions of dollars on solid state drives just to snoop into your business. That's not worth my time or money.
Yep. That's great. That's great. And I think that's the right attitude, right? I think that there was an earlier version, especially when, kind of cloud services started coming in, that you could just keep everything all the time, no ever, and I'm glad to hear, a little more enlightened view about that. Again, it's good for your users and it's good for you. And that's what we tend to say. When you stand with your users, we'll stand with you.
Yeah, exactly. That was unfortunately how we figured out a lot of the data security flaws in cloud computing. And with that in mind, like, are there any like model companies you would point to say, like, if you're starting a company and you want an excellent user data policy, like, start by emulating these guys?
Well, I mean, I guess I feel then I'm going to put my lawyer hat on for a little bit. You really need somebody to sit down and ask you what you're doing, because there are companies that have done really well on who has your back. Depending want to save you money by not having a little data, investing a little money to have a lawyer sit down and walk you through what do you need for your business, where do you need to do it, and then write a policy that actually reflects what you do is so much better. You're going to be so much better off than if you try to say, steal Twitters and adjust it where you need to adjust it. Lots of people do that. And I just use it. I mean, Twitter's an old enough company that actually, when Twitter started, they took another company's terms of service and used it as their terms of service. And I knew this because the first time I met with them, I went to look at their terms of service. It still had the other company's name in it. They hadn't even done that cut and paste. Now, that was a long time ago now, but again, and it didn't really reflect what they did. They'd taken a different kind of business's terms of service, probably because they seemed like cool people, but it didn't match at all what Twitter was doing. It was a photo storage thing, and so spend the time, just like you spend the time for some other things, to make sure that your policies fit what you need. And it shouldn't take a lawyer that long to do that, and there's plenty of small practitioners who will walk you through it. EFF does do a referral service, so if you need to be referred to somebody who can help you walk through that for your company, info@eff.org is our intake person, and she has a long list of lawyers who we will refer you to help you with that.
Excellent. I may end up taking you up on that at some point.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
with that the more legal element in mind, there's, especially during the coronavirus outbreak, there's been a whole slurry of new internet legislation popping up from all sides in DC. Some of it seems like it could be beneficial, but might have scary implications. Some of it's just outright ISP giveaways.
Mhm.
There's And then some of it that's being talked about is actually really positive, like adopting a federal version of like the CCPA, for instance. So let's play devil's advocate here for a second. I'm actually with the Kauffman Foundation. I'm going to be doing an advocacy session on Capitol Hill, or right now it looks like it's probably going to be through Zoom because of the outbreak. If there was any one or two policies you would have me push to these congressmen when I do that, or have anyone else in that position push, what would those policies be?
Well, and a second bill like the Earn It Act. Basically, bills that are aiming to make it impossible to deploy encryption, you know, real encryption. Working encryption, let's put it this way.
Exactly.
Sometimes they say strong and they'll be like, oh, the key length is really strong. And I'm like, well, but you can as long as strongest key if you want. If the key's also in the hands of somebody over there, it's not. So we call it working encryption as opposed to broken encryption. And the Earn It Act is kind of our public enemy number one right now at EF, because it's a double hit. It both tries to get rid of strong encryption, but it tries to do it by undermining the ability of platforms to be protected if somebody on their platform gets sued. If somebody, uploads a song to your system and it's got, it's offensive or it libels somebody. There was a guy in the Supreme Court who wrote a really awful song about his wife, ex-wife, that went to the Supreme Court. They can sue the person who wrote the song, but they can't hold you responsible unless you were, unless it was your song and you actively do it. That immunity, called Section CDA 230, underpins all the platforms. And so the Earn It Act is like, it's like an EFF double nightmare, right? Because it's taking away the platform immunity that makes it possible for most people to speak or upload, to make their own content online. Everything from TikTok to Facebook to streaming services to the Internet Archive, Wikimedia, they all depend on this immunity. And undermine strong encryption at the same time. So it's really those kinds of bills, and there's a new one that just got introduced, but the Earn It Act and its kind of ugly stepchildren are public enemy number one for us in DC.
Thank you, AG Barr. And it's really scary for music in particular, because that provides from what I read in it, that provides an extra leeway for copyright trolls to just start claiming up independently produced content that any idiot could see as fair use.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole other fight around the Copyright Act and the DMCA. We don't see anything being introduced yet, but there was just a bad Department of Justice report about how the Digital Millennium Copyright safe harbors needed to be adjusted, but basically meaning gutted. So keep your eyes open. We haven't seen it yet, but they're definitely working toward it. They may wait until after the election. I don't know, but right now, Earn It, kill this bill is our motto for Earn It and its others. But you're right, the DMCA stuff is coming. I'm quite concerned about the copyright safe harbors taking a hit.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of shifting back to the AI thing, I think we brushed on it briefly, but how do you see going forward this whole big data thing starting to affect the legal landscape? Because it's still kind of a seed right now. We don't really know what we're doing with this yet, but 10, 15 years down the line, human history sort of suggests that we're going to start to get pretty good with it by then. And that's when it's actually going to become both a huge help. I mean, it could make nuclear reactor, the fusion world will never be the same. There's no way we'd be able to model things like the Eider in France without something like AI. Humans just aren't that smart. But at the same time, I'd mentioned in the previous article, like there is a very real possibility someone at the DOJ is going to say, hey, I'm going to advance my career today by suggesting the idea of linking a weapons system to an artificial intelligence, which, as we've already discussed, who gets hurt when your system screws up? Are you going to bomb a whole village to the floor because it misidentified a terrorist? Are
Yeah.
you really willing to take that risk? So
I mean,
where do you see things heading here?
well, I mean, I think that, there's multiple possible timelines, right? I think that the better timeline comes if we get serious about what transparency looks like. If you're going to run one of these systems, what do you have to tell the public about it? You have to indicate where the training data came from. You have to indicate what you're solving for. I mean, a lot of these AI systems, they're not even really solving for the thing that we think they're solving for. Um, do you have a relative who went to prison? Well, you're solving for if you have a relative who went to prison, but then we're using that to design for other people. So I think we have to really think hard about transparency. We have to think hard about due process. If a decision gets made by one of these systems against you, what are your rights? Like, what do you get to find out? And right now we're at a very low level. We've had some DNA, probabilistic DNA cases, which is a form, it's not all the way to AI, but it's the same kinds of technologies where you're using probabilistic stuff to try to do it. And we can't even get access to the code. Like somebody just ran it and said, oh, this is what it came up with. And then we're like, well, we want to see it again. They're like, oh, we ran it a second time. So it confirmed, you're like, well, so we have a long way to go with transparency and due process about these systems before they're at the place where we ought to be making decisions about people's lives with them. And we need to start now. We need to start now with this. And companies, people who are building these things need to start voluntarily explaining what the hell they're doing. We shouldn't need a law for this.
Exactly. That's one of the big reasons I'm starting to do these, is to inspire other developers, let them know, like, you are the first line of defense in making sure the AI timeline doesn't get totally foobarred on us.
Yep.
And with that in mind, what are some examples of, if you can give me any, of unethical code that such a firm might ask its developers to push? Like, is there any particular thing that you should say red flag on?
Well, I think right now, anything that is basically being used as a lever that could discriminate, right? That could discriminate in a negative way. So, a while ago, we're involved in a case against Cisco for its work in China, building the Great Firewall of China. But we're specifically involved in the case because it looks like we've got evidence that what happened was Cisco built a system inside the Great Firewall of China that watches everything that goes on over the Chinese version of the network to help the Chinese government identify Falun Gong. To help the Chinese government identify people who are of a particular religious minority that the Chinese don't like. That's a thing, right? That's a thing you can use machine learning for. That's a thing you can do. Anybody who wants you to basically empower a government to treat people inequitably, to discriminate based on, race, religion, creed, all the things in the 14th Amendment, but, in international human rights law and discrimination, like you shouldn't do it. In fact, international human rights framework is not a bad way to start. Like, what are you doing? Are you making the world better? Or are you making it worse? And, in the context of search and seizure, we look at, is it necessary? Is it proportionate? What information are you gathering? And proportionality really matters, right? How much data are you chewing through to get to the one thing that you want? So I think that those are, anything that's going to aid in, discrimination, not, the kind of discrimination that we care about in the law, not, obviously the word means other things someplace else, and anything against disfavored minorities and anything that's going to help facilitate, human rights abuses, frankly. You have to look at what the system you're building is doing. And so many of these systems now, they're not general purpose. I mean, a router's a router, but a system that helps you identify whether people are Falun Gong or not. I mean, you don't accidentally make one of those, right? You have to know what you're doing.
it seems a historical parallel that comes to mind would be IBM's work for Nazi Germany in the 40s and 30s,
Yep.
developing the tracking system that you still see tattooed on people's wrists to this day. And we
Yep.
have proof that they could not have done it without support from the US databases.
Yep. And IBM is a double word, a double bad one because they helped build the apartheid regime in South Africa too,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
They helped create the whole network of past, basically papers that identified you and decided where you got to live and where you got to work and where you got to travel from. So it's pretty easy to figure out, well, it's not easy. There are hard edge cases, but there's a whole lot of easy ground. Like if you're facilitating discrimination like that, you probably ought to think hard and say no. Just say no.
Absolutely. And then on
Oh,
that
there's one
note,
more I should mention as well because it was such a,
please
with
do.
Project Maven and some of the other things, weapon systems, right? I think that people oppression of people or could be easily used for oppression of people. So I think that the folks at Google who raised concerns about Project Maven were right to raise them. And but there's a lot of companies doing it. There's a lot of people working at all those companies, and so the I think the time when people who were building tools could just sit back and say, well, it's not my job to decide whether they're being used reasonably or not. It's just my job to build the tool. 90s are over, my friend. We're in a modern era, and you have to think hard about all the ways in which something could be used and misused.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, I've got one last question for you. I know we've gone a little over here, so
Oh,
thank you.
sorry.
Oh, no, are you kidding? I'll take whatever I can get. Um, Say you are working for like an AWS who's building an immigrant tracker basically for Donald Trump to throw DACA recipients out with. Uh, what what would your recommended best practices for becoming like a leaker or a whistleblower be if you see something you know is wrong and you just can't continue to push code for it?
Well, I think again, I'm sorry I'm being a lawyer here. Get a lawyer to help you because depending on what kind of documents you've signed, where you are in a company, do you have a clearance or not, your risk factors could be very, very different. And you, again, you kind of, you can't, it's not, I would hate to give somebody general advice here and find out that their circumstances were very, very different. But look at what you signed, look at what the situation is. Do you have a clearance? There are lawyers. Again, I could probably help connect people with lawyers if they need to. I will say the one thing I will say is that at least under state laws, journalists in California, for instance, but in many other states, have the ability to protect their sources. Um, Congressmen generally have the ability to protect their sources. Most other people don't. So when people come to me at EFF and say, I've got all this secret information, I want to give it to you, I say, well, I don't have, unless I'm your lawyer, which is a very different arrangement. But as an activist organization, we don't have an ability to get any legal protection to protect our sources. But journalists do in California, journalists do in many other places. So big picture, that's kind of how the law is set up. But for any individual, find yourself a lawyer, come to me, I'll get you a lawyer, and we'll make sure we do this with the amount of risk that is you're comfortable with.
Yeah, you don't put yourself in a position to end up holed up in a apartment in Russia.
Well, I think that Mr. Snowden did a lot of these things right, but if you could compare him to, say, Reality Winner, who didn't get good help, you can see some pretty big differences. And so trying to make sure that on the one hand, and I don't think Mr. Stone's very happy being in Moscow. On the other hand, he had stuff of a very different nature than most people are going to have inside their companies, and so his risk factors were much higher and different than somebody who's inside, say, an Amazon. So and so he took a lot of precautions, but there's always risk in these kinds of things.
Absolutely. And hats off to those with the balls to take that kind of risk, frankly, because We need more of those people.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly have changed the world, right? All the way from Daniel Ellsberg, and all the way through. We've had lots of people who've been brave and have helped change the course of the world, which is awesome.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I'll send you a link to the article as soon as I've got a write-up about this.
Terrific. Thanks, Carter. I'll have them tweeted out from the EFF account. So,
Awesome. Thank you so much.
all right. Thanks very much. It was nice talking to you again.
Yeah, likewise.